Decisive Chapter 10. Book and the Future 1. One of Byron Penstock's most prized possessions is a photo of him with his hero, investor Warren Buffett. Penstock can quote Buffett's shareholder letters from decades ago, and when he talks about the value investing approach to stocks, he lights up. You get the feeling that if he had a wallet-sized photo of his portfolio, he'd show it to you. Penstock didn't always want to be an investor. In his early 20s, he was a minor league hockey player, a goalie for the Baltimore Bandits. Later he went into corporate law, a profession he quickly grew to despise. But when he discovered investing, he fell hard. After attending Harvard Business School, he landed his first investing job at RS Investments, a mutual fund company based in San Francisco. Determined to succeed, Penstock would show up at the office at 3 a.m. to get a head start on the day. In late 2009, Penstock was keeping an eye on the stock of Coinstar, a company with two primary lines of business. The company's original business was its line of Coinstar machines, usually found in grocery stores, which counted customers' coins and gave them a voucher that could be exchanged for bills, while keeping a small percentage of the haul. This coin-counting business was successful and stable, and Coinstar already dominated the market to such an extent that future growth was expected to be slow. Coinstar's second line of business was Redbox, a line of DVD renting kiosks. The company's early experiments with Redbox had yielded mixed results, but at one point the executives tried pricing the DVD rentals at $1 per movie per night. Sales exploded. At first, executives weren't sure they could make money at such a low price, but the volume of rentals spiked so dramatically that it compensated for the lower margin. Coinstar suddenly had a fast-growth business on its hands. On the strength of the Redbox business, Coinstar's revenues more than doubled between 2007 and 2008, from $307 million to $762 million. The Redbox kiosks multiplied rapidly, with 13,700 units installed by the end of 2008. In December 2008, Redbox encountered some trouble. Universal Studios announced that it would no longer sell its DVDs to Redbox. The studio executives were concerned that Redbox threatened Universal's lucrative DVD sales. Why should customers pay $18 to own a DVD, when they could watch it anytime for $1? About 9 months later, two more of the biggest Hollywood studios, Warner Bros. and 20th Century Fox, cut off Redbox. Investors started to freak out. How could you run a DVD business without DVDs? As the uncertainty sank in, Coinstar stock plunged by about 25% in a month. But Penstock knew the panic was overblown. The previous year he had felt blindsided by Universal's announcement, so he'd begun to investigate the relationship between the studios and Redbox. One thing that surprised him was that, after Universal cut off Redbox, the kiosks were still carrying Universal movies, such as Forgetting Sarah Marshall and Frost Nixon. How was Redbox getting the DVDs? Some calls to Redbox cleared up the mystery. The drivers who restocked the Redbox kiosks had added a new stop on their routes, Walmart. They were buying Universal's new releases over the counter at Walmart and then loading them into Redbox's machines. This guerrilla approach seemed absurd at first, but Penstock's research suggested it wasn't crazy. There were no legal issues prohibiting Redbox from buying DVDs over the counter and then renting them. In fact, Redbox sometimes saved money by buying the DVDs from Walmart, because the new release DVDs were discounted so heavily. So when 20th Century Fox and Warner Bros. cut off Redbox, Penstock knew it was a nuisance rather than a catastrophe. Investors were overreacting, he thought. He began to create some financial models, to see whether he could make money on the stock. Penstock uses a method he calls bookending, which involves estimating two different scenarios: a dire scenario, the lower bookend, where things go badly for a company, and a rosy scenario, the upper bookend, where the company gets a lot of breaks. For example, suppose Penstock ran the numbers and predicted that, depending on what happened in the global oil markets, the bookends for ExxonMobil stock would be $50 per share and $100 per share. If the current price for the stock was $90, then he'd never make that investment. It would be too close to the upper bookend, offering a small upside and a huge downside. Even a price right in the middle, $75 per share, would be too risky for Penstock. I'm looking for businesses that have a wide range of potential outcomes but a stock price that's to the far left of the range, he said. Penstock guessed that Coinstar fit the favorable pattern, so he began to analyze the company's bookends. To set the lower bookend, he considered a truly draconian scenario, in which executives abandoned the Redbox business altogether, selling all the kiosks and DVDs to a competitor for their replacement value. By Penstock's estimates, that scenario would justify a share price of roughly $21. Then, turning his attention to the upper bookend, Penstock computed that, if the Redbox team had some good fortune, the share price could climb to $62 within 2 years. Meanwhile, after the Fox and Warner announcements, the actual stock price had begun to creep downward toward $30 per share. Now Penstock became convinced he had a great investment on his hands. The stock price was moving toward his lower bookend. And in his eyes, the lower bookend was absurd. In his liquidation scenario, he had assumed that Redbox was just selling its machines, that its locations was worth nothing, when in fact Redbox had locked up the best locations in the market, including Walmart and most grocery store chains. The rights to those locations would be of immense strategic value to competitors, worth much more than the machines. Redbox's customer relationships and its brand were also free in the bleed scenario. Using this analysis, Penstock convinced his colleagues at RS Investments to place a big bet on Coinstar. When the stock hit $28, they began to buy shares. According to his analysis, their downside was $7 and their upside was $34 in November and December 2009. Penstock's firm bought almost 1.4 million shares at an average price of $26.70. In the months that followed, he monitored the stock anxiously, and the price began to tick up. Investors grew increasingly confident that Coinstar wasn't in serious danger. The stock price cracked $30 and continued to climb. By the fall of 2010, the stock price was bouncing around in the 40s. Penstock was elated. His firm had made more than $25 million on his analysis. As the price rose, though, he grew less confident in the investment. The price was inching steadily toward the upper bookend he had created. By mid-October, Penstock had concluded that the stock was no longer a good bet, and he recommended that the firm sell its holdings, and it did, at an average price of $46.54. The firm had scored a return of about 75% in 10 months. Penstock's strategy of bookending is atypical of investors. Many investors, he said, try to make a precise prediction of what a stock is really worth. It's sometimes called a target price, and if the target price is higher than the current price, investors decide they should buy. Penstock rejects this kind of thinking. His belief is that computing a precise target stock price reflects a false confidence about the future. He said, "It's my job as an investor to think about the future, but the future is uncertain, so my investments can't hinge on knowing the future. I look for situations where the bookends suggest that I can invest wisely without knowing exactly what the future holds." He calls this low IQ investing. Our purpose in offering this example is not to encourage you to run Penstock's game plan as you invest your retirement dollars. Investing in individual stocks is a losing proposition for most people. For one thing, you're competing against full-time professionals like Penstock, who are waking up at 3 a.m. to work on their analyses, and even so, 96% of them manage to underperform a simple index fund. See the endnotes if you want our full soapbox rant on why your retirement dollars are better off in index funds than in individual stocks or mutual funds. We offer the example because we do want to recommend Penstock's approach to life decisions. His humility about his predictive abilities is critical to making a good decision. What if we, like Penstock, could make wise choices without knowing exactly what the future holds? To do this we have to prepare to be wrong about our predictions of the future. That's the P in the RAP model. We need to stretch our sense of what the future might bring, considering many possibilities, both good and bad, which is exactly the discipline reflected in Penstock's bookending philosophy. Penstock developed his procedure intuitively, but there's research evidence that backs up his approach. In one study, researchers Jack Saul and Joshua Clayman asked participants to make a series of guesses. As one example, they were asked to estimate the average box office receipts of movies in the 1990s that featured Angelina Jolie. They specified a range that was 80% sure to contain the true value, e.g., I'm 80% certain that the average Angelina Jolie film grossed between $30 million and $100 million. At 80% confidence, the participants should have been surprised only 20% of the time, but it turned out they were overconfident. The actual box office average fell outside of their ranges 61% of the time. What's interesting is that people's estimates grew much more accurate when they were asked to explicitly consider the high and low ends of the range. The researchers suggested that by considering each bookend separately, people tap different pools of knowledge. So if you think about why Jolie's average films might be low-grossing, you might remember some of the low-budget indie films she made in the mid-1990s, when she was a relatively unknown actress. Or if you're thinking about why her average film might gross more than $100 million, you might recall Lara Croft, Tomb Raider, which was such a big hit that it might inflate the average. The actual answer is that Jolie's average box office in the 1990s was only $13 million. Lara Croft, Tomb Raider, with a box office of $131 million, didn't appear until 2001. Overall, the researchers found that when people did not consider the bookends, they produced ranges that were only 45%, as wide as they should have been when compared to a statistically optimal model. When they were asked to consider the bookends, their guesses improved to 70% of optimal, and when they also added their best guess in the middle, which tapped a third pool of knowledge, their ranges improved to 96% of the optimal size, only 4% away from perfection. When we think about the extremes, we stretch our sense of what's possible, and that expanded range better reflects reality. Penstock and other investors use that expanded range to make smart bets on stocks. But the rest of us aren't betting on the outcome, we're living it. So we need to be prepared to deal with any outcome between the two bookends we've charted. To prepare for the lower bookend, we need the equivalent of insurance. If you buy a new car, you'll increase the amount of collision insurance you buy, so that if you wreck your car, you can replace it. Have you thought about how to insure your organization against a wreck of a new hire? For the upper bookend, we need a plan for dealing with unexpected success. Think of a boutique designer who finds out that Oprah will be endorsing her product soon. Will she be ready to handle the huge spike in demand? When we bookend the future, we anticipate and plan for the best outcomes as well as the worst. In the absence of bookending, our spotlights will lock onto our best guess of how the future will unfold, like investors trying to estimate the true target stock price of a company. Even if we have a pretty good guess about the future, the research on overconfidence suggests that we'll be wrong more often than we think. The future isn't a point, it's a range. How can we learn to sweep a broader landscape with our spotlights, to attend to the bookend of possibilities ahead? Psychologists have actually created some simple tools for exactly this purpose. Try the following thought experiment. How likely is it that an Asian American will be elected President of the United States in November 2020? Jot down some reasons why this might happen. That scenario was adapted from the work of decision researchers J. Edward Russo and Paul J. H. Shoemaker. Now try the second part of the thought experiment, which is similar but has a twist. Pay attention to how it feels to think about this one. It is November 2020 and something historic has just happened. The United States has just elected its first Asian American president. Think about all the reasons why this might have happened. Russo and Shoemaker have found that when people adopt the second style of thinking using prospective hindsight to work backward from a certain future, they are better at generating explanations for why the event might happen. You may have experienced this yourself. The second scenario feels a bit more concrete, offering firmer cognitive footholds. In the original study of prospective hindsight, researchers presented participants with a description of an employee who just started a new job, including a quick sketch of the relevant company and industry. Half the participants were asked to generate plausible reasons why the employee might quit 6 months from now. On average, they generated 3.5 reasons each. The other half were told to use the hindsight approach. Imagine that it's 6 months from now and the employee has just quit. Why did he quit? In this group, participants generated 4.4 reasons apiece, about 25% more than the other group, and their reasons tended to be more specific and relevant to the scenario presented. Prospective hindsight seems to spur more insights, because it forces us to fill in the blanks between today and a certain future event, as opposed to the slipperier process of speculating about an event that may or may not happen. The psychologist Gary Klein, inspired by this research, devised a method for testing decisions that he calls the pre-mortem. A post-mortem analysis begins after a death and asks, what caused it? A pre-mortem, by contrast, imagines the future death of a project and asks, what killed it? A team running a pre-mortem analysis starts by assuming a bleak future. Okay, it's 12 months from now, and our project was a total fiasco. It blew up in our faces. Why did it fail? Everyone on the team takes a few minutes to write down every conceivable reason for the project's failure. Then the team leader goes around the table, asking each person to share a single reason, until all the ideas have been shared. Once all the threats have been surfaced, the project team can prepare to be wrong by adapting its plans to forestall as many of the negative scenarios as possible. The pre-mortem is, in essence, a way of charting out the lower bookend of future possibilities, and plotting ways to avoid ending up there. 2. A variation of this pre-mortem strategy was used by the 100,000 Homes campaign, an effort to house 100,000 chronically homeless individuals. The campaign, with its unprecedented scale, was orchestrated by a small organization of a few dozen people called Community Solutions. Its leader was Becky Kennis, a woman who combined the passion of an activist with the discipline of a soldier. She was a West Point graduate, who'd spent 9 years as an Army officer. In planning the campaign, Kennis and her colleagues sought advice from experts like Christina Gunther Murphy, an executive who had worked on a similar campaign in healthcare, to save 100,000 lives by changing medical practices. Find someone who has solved your problem. Gunther Murphy introduced them to a technique called failure mode and effect analysis (FMEA), a precursor to the pre-mortem that has been used for decades in the military and government. In an FMEA, team members identify what could go wrong at every step of their plans, and for each potential failure they ask 2 questions: how likely is it? And how severe would the consequences be? After assigning a score from 1 to 10 for each variable, they multiply the 2 numbers to get a total. The highest totals, the most severe potential failures, get the most attention. Section. At a spring 2010 meeting of the 100,000 Homes team, an FMEA revealed a number of possible stumbling blocks. One of them was particularly troubling: what if our approach violates laws about fair housing? A staffer named Beth Sander described a tricky situation in Los Angeles. A developer had refused to give preference to a homeless person for an open subsidized housing slot in the building he owned. He had a waiting list for the unit, and he argued that letting the homeless man skip to the top of the line would be an illegal act of favoritism that would put his federal subsidies at risk. Sanders' response was that the homeless person deserved housing soonest, because he was in danger of dying if he wasn't sheltered quickly. The 100,000 Homes staffers prioritized the most vulnerable homeless people for the housing. She argued, look, everyone on your waiting list has an address. If they've had an address for the 5 years they've spent on the list, then they can't be the neediest people. After Sanders shared her experience at the meeting, others piped up with similar stories. When they conducted the FMEA, the housing issue scored as one of the highest potential threats. If landlords wouldn't move quickly to place the homeless, the campaign would be in trouble. The group brainstormed about how to prevent the problem. One woman on the team knew a lawyer, who was a nationally recognized expert on fair housing law, and the team agreed to seek his opinion. He warned them that he'd need to research the matter, and that he couldn't guarantee that his opinion would support them. Nonetheless, the team agreed to proceed, reasoning that if the law was against them, it was something they needed to know sooner rather than later. A few months later, the attorney came back with a strong legal brief demonstrating that the team's work did not violate the fair housing. Since then, the brief has essentially eliminated the issue. Now the issue never comes up anymore, said Sander. It allowed us to move on. Thanks to its pre-mortem, the team was able to surface and eliminate a threat to the campaign. And that allowed them to spend less time worrying about legal issues and more time finding shelter for the most vulnerable people in the country. One of those people was Myron, a veteran who was living on the streets of Phoenix. Myron and his brother Howard had been homeless for about 30 years. Then, on a brutally hot night in July 2009, Howard died in his brother's arms. Myron cradled him on a park bench, crying, until help arrived. He didn't care about anything after his brother passed, said Maddie Lord, the project lead at Project Age 3, a local affiliate of the 100,000 Homes campaign. Lord and her colleagues met Myron when they were surveying the homeless population of Phoenix. They rated Myron one of the 15 most vulnerable people on the streets of Phoenix. Lord said, "We are going to house this man, come hell or high water." Other local agencies scoffed at the idea that Myron could get off the streets. He was disagreeable, cantankerous, and depressed. He had an alcohol problem. He hated bureaucrats. But within 3 months, Lord and her team had located an apartment for him. When they handed him the keys, Myron couldn't believe it. It would be his first home in over 3 decades. Move-in day was emotional. The campaign workers cooked Myron's favorite meal, spaghetti, and as a housewarming gift, they gave him a framed picture of him with his brother. It brought Myron to tears. He immediately took it to the bedroom and placed it beside his bed. Having his own home transformed Myron. He no longer had to focus all his energies on survival. He reconnected with his family, going to visit his sister, whom he hadn't seen in many years. "People who knew Myron before are in disbelief," said Lord. "He is happy." Myron grew very sick in the winter of 2010, and he was relocated to the state veterans home. He has since recovered, though he is still frail. Lord describes him as a social butterfly, who knows everything about people's kids and relatives. He still talks to his family every week. Lord takes special pride in Myron's new life. He was the case everybody said, "It can't be done." We proved them wrong. Across the country, people like Myron are being given keys to new homes and new lives. By the summer of 2012, communities participating in the 100,000 Homes campaign had placed 20,000 homeless people in homes. Months prior, when they housed the 10,000th homeless person, the team held a celebration, and Kenneth, the West Point graduate who leads the campaign, actually had the number tattooed on her arm. But she deliberately put the comma in the wrong place, 100,000. She told her team, "I want to show you my full faith and confidence, that together we will help 100,000 people move off the streets for good." And when they succeed, Kenneth said, she'll add that final 0 to her tattoo, 100,000. The FMEA and its sister technique, the pre-mortem, stop people from focusing on a single, usually optimistic, guess about how the world will unfold, and instead compel them to pay attention to the uncertainties surrounding the guess. The effort it takes to explore the full spectrum of possibilities, and to prepare for the worst possible scenarios acts powerfully to counteract overconfidence. Our judgment can be wrong in multiple ways. We might err by failing to consider the problems we could encounter, and that's why we need pre-mortems. However, we might also err by failing to prepare for unexpectedly good outcomes. When we bookend the future, it's important to consider the upside as well as the downside. That's why, in addition to running a pre-mortem, we need to run a prep raid. A prep raid asks us to consider success. Let's say it's a year from now, and our decision has been a wild success. It's so great that there's going to be a parade in our honor. Given that future, how do we ensure that we are ready for it? In 1977, a small entrepreneurial company called Minnetonka found itself with a potential blockbuster on its hands. Minnetonka was known for niche novelty items such as bubble baths, scented candles, and flavored lip balm, but a new product was showing extraordinary potential. It was called soft soap, a liquid soap dispensed from a plastic hand pump, intended to be used for hand washing at home. At the time, most people used bars of soap to wash their hands, and the bar soap market was dominated by mature brands such as Dial, Ivory, and Zest. The companies behind them battled fiercely for every percentage point of market share. Yet Minnetonka's pilot testing, conducted in small markets under the radar of the bar soap manufacturers, found that soft soap rapidly captured 4% to 9% market share within a short time. Having reached successfully with these pilot tests in multiple markets, Minnetonka's executives were ready to leap. It was time for a national product rollout. Were they ready? The company's prior products, the lip balms and bubble baths, never had the market-shifting potential of soft soap. The executives began to discuss how they could prepare for the huge success they thought might be possible. The supply chain was a critical consideration. If consumers responded nationally with the same enthusiasm they'd shown in the local tests, then Minnetonka would need to make millions of bottles of soft soap. Unfortunately, there were only 2 suppliers of the kind of plastic pumps that could be used to dispense the liquid soap. What if they couldn't get enough pumps to satisfy the consumer demand? To prepare for a world that might unfold in this favorable way, Minnetonka's executives took a bold step. They signed options contracts with both suppliers, for a total of up to 100 million units. They'd effectively locked up the world's entire supply of plastic pumps for a period of 18 to 24 months. By conducting a prep raid, the company's executives ensured that Minnetonka would have the ability to handle success. The clever plastic pump contracts kept the big bar soap manufacturers out of the market for 2 years, and by the time they eventually entered the market, soft soap had created a dominant position for itself that would last for decades. PREMORTEMS and PREPARADES are most effective at tackling problems and opportunities that can be reasonably foreseen. There's another technique that is useful in guarding against the unknown. It's surprisingly simple. In fact, just assume that you're being overconfident, and give yourself a healthy margin of error. Many engineers, for example, have learned to build a safety factor into their projects. Safety factors emerged from engineers' healthy paranoia about defects, since their computations can have life and death consequences. How much concrete is needed to support a dam? How strong do the materials in an airplane wing need to be? Engineers can compute the appropriate numbers using highly sophisticated tools, but these numbers have a false certainty about them. One of the variables could change in a completely unexpected way. Suppose, as a far-fetched example, that a commercial airplane pilot plowed through a flock of Canadian geese, disabling his 2 engines and necessitating an emergency landing on a river. That impact would put huge, unexpected strain on the airplane wings. This far-fetched example really happened, of course. In 2009, pilot Chesley Sully Sullenberger landed the plane safely in the Hudson River. Amazingly, no lives were lost, thanks to his skill and, also, the engineer's safety factors. In a more everyday example, engineers might compute, in designing a ladder, that it needed to be able to support 400 pounds, but then they'd multiply that number by a safety factor of, say, 6. As a result, the ladder would be built to withstand 2,400 pounds. That way, if 8 huge men of questionable judgment someday decide to climb the ladder together, it will hold. No one will get hurt and no one will get sued. The safety factor varies by domain. For the space shuttle's ground equipment, it's 4. For an elevator cable, it's 11. So next time you're in a crowded elevator, doing an anxious computation of group weight, just relax. What's remarkable here is the odd mixture of scientific precision and crude guesstimation. In computing the required strength of an elevator cable, engineers use incredibly sophisticated algorithms and tools. Then, having found the best answer that science has to offer, they take that answer and multiply it by the semi-arbitrary number of 11. It's like an exercise that a third grader would do in a math workbook. But this crude approach saves lives, and it exhibits an admirable humility. We engineers know that we will be prone to overconfidence, and it's not possible to render ourselves immune to it, so why not just correct for it? The same principle works in less risky contexts as well. Software companies have evolved their own safety factors to pad their project deadlines. Developers at Microsoft, confident in their programming prowess, will often grossly underestimate the amount of time required to reach a goal. So the leaders of the software projects, aware of the developers' overconfidence, have learned to tack on a buffered factor equal to, say, 30% of the schedule. For more complex projects, such as an operating system, the buffer might reach 50%. Though given past OS delays, that buffer factor might need its own buffered factor. 3. Notice that these corrections for overconfidence have in common a kind of ego-checking, balloon-bursting effect. We run a pre-mortem, which forces us to ask, our precious project has flopped. Why? Or we add buffer time to a schedule, because we've learned to distrust our own optimism. This ego-checking is good for us, it helps to stack the deck in our favor. Often, though, we instinctively do the opposite. When it comes to hiring a worker, for instance, the process is all about positivity and ego inflation. The worker presents a glowing portrait of her talents, and the employer presents a rosy portrait of the job. It's like dating, the dirty laundry isn't aired until much later. Because of this false sunniness, it can be difficult for both parties, employer and candidate alike, to get an accurate picture of the choice they're making. Can I tolerate this job? Can we tolerate this employee? The cost of a mismatch is high. For entry-level jobs, call center representatives, food service workers, and so on, it's not uncommon for annual turnover to be as high as 130%. This means that if a call center has 100 jobs, then the HR team would need to hire 130 people every single year to keep the positions filled. The constant rotation causes enormous waste for companies, who must recruit and train workers, who end up leaving in a few weeks. Not to mention the unnecessary misery for employees, who find themselves in environments they can't abide. In response to this problem, some companies are experimenting with a new approach, to hiring, a balloon-bursting approach. Consider a website that was created in 2011, to allow people to apply for a call center position. It exposes applicants to a set of cautions and warnings. You will interact with frustrated and demanding customers every day. You will be expected to provide superb customer service, and be friendly under stressful conditions. After reading some sobering information about compensation, you will receive pay only for the time you spend taking customer calls. Applicants are required to listen to an audio clip labeled sample challenging call, taken from an actual call center rep. My name is Jose. May I have your first and last name, please? Customer, yes, this is name censored. Jose, thank you. How may I help you today, please? Customer, yeah, we've had this problem before. This is a complaint about billing and about overbilling and about data usage charges. If you would, could you bring up my bill summary? Jose, okay, yes, sir. Customer, you'll see that under usage charges, it says data, $1.10. You all have charged us for data before, a couple of times, and we've called each time and said that we don't use data on our phones. We've actually even had data disabled on our phones. And I know for a fact that you sneak these charges, and because people don't call about $1.10, because it's just $1.10. And you sneak this into people's bills and everybody pays it. But this is criminal. It's awful. Voice getting angrier. I want this $1.10 removed from my bill, and I never want to be charged for data usage again. After listening to the irate customer, applicants are asked, are you sure you will be able to tolerate on a daily basis assisting customers who are rude, frustrated, or confused? On subsequent pages, applicants are warned about the difficult system, the stringent on-time policy, the requirement to work overtime and holidays, the discomfort of sharing a desk with people who work other shifts, which means they won't be able to hang photos or otherwise humanize their workspace, and the need to find a reliable way to get to work other than public transportation, since they will frequently work after the city buses have shut down. Relative to any normal hiring process, this is a serious buzzkill. It's like a guy kicking off a first date by declaring, I should tell you up front, that I'm broke and depressed, my belly roll strongly suggests a future as a diabetic, and, like an infant, my moods tend to vary directly with my digestion. Shall we head out to dinner? The call center's warts and all hiring approach is called a realistic job preview. Max Simkoff, the CEO of Evolve, the company that built the realistic job preview described above, said that many hiring professionals don't understand the power of setting expectations. In a typical call center, Simkoff said, there are seats that turn over 3 or 4 times a year. So then the call center people immediately react, we're hiring the wrong people. we need to revisit our competency model. And we say, no, you're actually not doing a good job of explaining the job situation to the people that you hire. Realistic job previews have been proven, by a large research literature, to reduce turnover. Sumcoff shared one of Evolve's own case studies concerning a call center that had been hiring roughly 5,400 people per year. After implementing realistic job previews, new hires dropped by more than 10% over the next 12 months, 572 fewer hires, with a cumulative savings of about $1.6 million. The idea has been tried with a host of professions, including grocery baggers, customs inspectors, nurses, Army and Navy recruits, life insurance agents, bank tellers, and hotel desk clerks. Analyzing 40 different studies of realistic job previews, researcher Gene Phillips found that, as in the case of the call center, the practice consistently reduces turnover. But the reason why may be different from what you'd guess. You might assume that realistic job previews succeed by scaring away people who couldn't have handled the job. That's true to some extent, but it's a relatively small factor. In fact, in some of the studies Phillips reviewed, people exposed to the job preview were no more likely to drop out of the recruitment process than other recruits, who didn't get the full, unvarnished truth. Instead, the success of realistic job previews seems to be driven by what Phillips calls a vaccination effect. By exposing people to a small dose of organizational reality before they start work, you vaccinate them against shock and disappointment. So at the call center, when a new customer service rep finds herself on a call with an angry guy, she isn't taken aback. She was expecting it. This explains an otherwise puzzling fact: realistic job previews have been shown to reduce turnover even when they are given after the employee is hired. The previews are not just helping the wrong people opt out of the hiring process, they're helping all people cope better when they confront the inevitable difficulties of the role. In fact, realistic job previews not only reduce turnover but also increase job satisfaction. As a manager, you could use a realistic job preview to help vaccinate the new hires at your organization. You might also use one yourself to prepare for decisions you've made. If you've got a product launch looming in 3 months, for example, wouldn't it be worth getting a job preview of the launch period from someone who's handled a similar project? Or, in another domain, what would happen to college dropout rates if all freshmen got a realistic job preview from senior students describing their toughest moments in college? Realistic job previews trigger our coping mechanisms, but they also spark us to think about how we'll react. In other words, we don't just think about tough situations, we think about how we'll respond when we encounter them. A similar mental simulation approach is used by counselors specializing in cognitive behavioral therapy (CBT). CBT emphasizes the value of mentally rehearsing how to respond in difficult interpersonal situations. In the book Thoughts and Feelings, Taking Control of Your Moods and Your Life, therapists Matthew McKay, Martha Davis, and Patrick Fanning recount the case of Sandra, who wanted to ask her boss for a raise but was very nervous about it. Sandra wrote out a script that represented the way she wanted to behave, and also anticipated how she would respond if the situation took a wrong turn. In the initial part of her mental script, she imagines herself approaching her boss and asking for 15 minutes of his time to discuss a raise. He gets a little evasive, but she tells herself to be persistent, and eventually pins him down on a meeting time. Later, when the time comes, she pictures herself walking into his office and sinking into the blue chair, where guests are always asked to sit. She imagines having to turn the conversation from casual small talk to her request, a 10% raise. She explains that she's been stuck at the same salary level for a long time, despite her track record of good performance. Now we pick up on her imagined script in her own words. He looks displeased and replies that the department isn't doing well, and we all have to learn to live with less. I think I deserve this. Don't give up. I point out that it would be more cost-effective to give me a raise than to train a new employee to take over my responsibilities. He continues to be negative. I take a deep breath and remind myself to be strong and calm, and that I deserve the raise. I say that if I can't get the raise I deserve, I'll start looking for a new job. He offers a 5% raise. I stick to my demand and remind myself and him that I'm competent and experienced. He eventually agrees after seeing that I won't be budged. I thank him, make sure to ask when the raise goes into effect, and walk out of his office feeling elated. Note that Sandra is preparing for various ways the interaction could go wrong. She imagines her boss looking displeased with her request. When he invokes social pressure, we all have to learn to live with less. She rallies herself to keep pressing her argument, noting that it is more cost-effective to give me a raise than to train a new employee. She practiced the scene 4 times in her imagination, and then asked her husband to role-play the tough boss. Finally, after all of these preparations, she was ready. The next time she encountered her boss in the staff lounge, she asked for a meeting. He accepted. She made her pitch, and the boss, as expected, was a tough negotiator. Nevertheless, she left with an 8% raise. What Sandra had done, in essence, was give herself a realistic job preview of what it would be like to ask for a raise. Her decision was made. She knew she needed to ask for a raise. Given the decision, how could she best improve her odds? She found that anticipating the future, including its potential unpleasantness, helped her prepare. That's a strategy we can all emulate. Overconfidence about the future disrupts our decisions. It makes us lackadaisical about preparing for problems. It tempts us to ignore early signs of failure. It leaves us unprepared for pleasant surprises. Fighting overconfidence means we've got to treat the future as a spectrum, not a point. Byron Penstock didn't try to predict a target price for the Redbox business. Instead, he created a bookend of possibilities. His low IQ investment strategy helped him make a bold investment choice. To bookend the future means that we must sweep our spotlights from side to side, charting out the full territory of possibilities. Then we can stack the deck in our favor, by preparing for both bad situations via pre-mortem and good via prep-raid. The 100,000 Hums team staved off a critical legal problem by running a pre-mortem. Minnetonka set itself up for success with SoftSoap by locking down the world's supply of plastic pumps. Even when we can't minimize bad outcomes, we still do ourselves a favor by considering them. Realistic job previews inoculate people against disappointment and increase their satisfaction, even in the midst of a difficult job. It's easier to cope with setbacks when we are mentally prepared for them. Stacking the deck makes us more likely to succeed, but even with the best forethought and planning, sometimes things don't go well. We've all seen people make a bad initial decision and then double down on their choice, throwing good money after bad. How do we know when it's time to reassess a choice we've made? What could we learn that would make us retreat from a choice we've made? Conversely, what would make us redouble our efforts? What we need is a tool for snapping us awake at just the right moment, ensuring that we don't miss a chance to cut our losses, or to maximize our opportunities. What we need, in short, is a tripwire. Chapter 10 in one-page book and the future 1. The future is not a point, a single scenario that we must predict. It is a range. We should bookend the future, considering a range of outcomes from very bad to very good. Investor Penstock bet on Coinstar when his bookend analysis showed much more upside than downside. Our predictions grow more accurate when we stretch our bookends outward. 2. To prepare for the lower bookend, we need a pre-mortem. It's a year from now. Our decision has failed utterly. Why? The 100,000 Hums campaign avoided a legal threat by using a pre-mortem style analysis. 3. To be ready for the upper bookend, we need a prep raid. It's a year from now. We are heroes. Will we be ready for success? The producer of SoftSoap, hoping for a huge national launch, locked down the supply of plastic pumps for 18 to 24 months. 4. To prepare for what can't be foreseen, we can use a safety factor. Elevator cables are made 11 times stronger than needed. Software schedules included a buffer factor. 5. Anticipating problems helps us cope with them. The realistic job preview, revealing a job's warts up front, vaccinates people against dissatisfaction. Sandra rehearsed how she would ask her boss for a raise, and what she'd say and do at various problem moments. 6. By bookending, anticipating and preparing for both adversity and success, we stack the deck in favor of our decisions. Contrary to the threatening-sounding warnings at the beginning of some DVDs, the first sale legal doctrine preserves the rights of a buyer to rent, sell, or lend their purchase to others. Dire and rosy scenarios are not intended to be the most extreme outcomes imaginable, e.g., bankruptcy versus an accidental discovery of a universal weight loss pill, just very negative and very positive outcomes with real-world assumptions. The researchers asked questions such as, what's a high value for Angelina Jolie's average box office that you think has only a 10% chance of being exceeded? And what's a lower boundary so low that there's only a 10% chance of the real number falling below it? Note that this is how the Community Solutions team implements FMEA. Other flavors of FMEA include a third question: how likely is it that we will be unable to detect the failure if it happens? And multiply the three variables together. Parenthetically, this is why the realistic job preview fits in the prepare to be wrong part of the RAP process, because it's not primarily a tool designed to help people decide which option to pick. As mentioned before, Philips found that applicants only rarely changed their decision and withdrew after being exposed to the preview. Their decision had been made: I want this job. But what the realistic job preview does, via the vaccination effect, is improve the odds that the person's decision will succeed, that they'll stay in the job and be happy with it. Chapter 11. 11 Set a Tripwire 1. Zappos, the online shoe store, has earned a reputation for exceptional customer service, and stories circulate about the company's most outlandish service feats. In one case, a customer had traveled to Vegas, where Zappos is headquartered, only to realize that she'd forgotten her favorite shoes. So she called Zappos, hoping to buy a second pair, but the customer service rep found that the shoes were out of stock. Unfazed, the rep hopped in his car, drove to a competitor's store, purchased the shoes, and dropped them off at the customer's hotel. In another situation, a customer had been given a refund for a pair of shoes, but she hadn't yet mailed back the shoes to Zappos. So a rep called her to check on the shipment, and the customer apologized, but explained that her mom had just died. She said she'd take the shoes to UPS as soon as she could. A few minutes later, she got an email saying that the rep had arranged a home pickup by UPS so she wouldn't have to worry about making the trip. The next day, a florist delivered a big basket of white lilies and roses. Zappos' culture is fun and intense. For some people it's heaven, and for others it's just too much. As a result, in hiring new employees, the company pays a lot of attention to fit. Consider the experience of John Wolsk, who interviewed in 2007 for a customer service job. He was 30 years old, and had spent the previous few years working in the production of live Vegas shows. Exhausted by the grind of show business, he was ready for a change. Having worked previously at a call center, he was not eager to return to the corporate world, but he thought, I'm 30 years old, I'm on call at all hours, and I have no insurance. If I break my leg, I'm in trouble. He'd heard that Zappos was hiring, so he applied. When he got a call to come in an interview, he strapped on his power tie and headed out to the company's headquarters on the outskirts of Vegas. He was led into a corporate conference room that had been redecorated to look like a beach cabana. He took his seat in a beach chair and glanced up at the ceiling, which was painted sky blue. His interviewers, wearing jeans, asked him strange questions. Do you feel lucky in life? On a 10-point scale, how weird are you? He gave himself a 7 or 8. Eventually he asked if he could take off his tie, which was evidently the right move, because he was offered a position in the next customer service class. His fellow trainees in the 4-week program included a wide range of people, even the incoming head of it. Everyone at Zappos, no matter what role, begins their job with customer service training. By the end of the first day, everyone in the class had spent 2 hours side by side with experienced customer service reps, listening to how they handled customer calls. Wolsk found that he had a lot to learn about shoes. Before Zappos, my shoe IQ was really, really bad, he said. For a long time I didn't even know wide-width shoes existed. I was 26 before I realized I had a wide foot. The second week of the training class held a surprise. The group's primary trainer left the room and another person came in to address them, saying, "You've seen what we have to offer and who we are. If we hire you, believing you're fit for the culture, but you don't like it here, then it's not going to be a great place for you to grow. We don't want you to just stick around and feel like you're stuck because you've got a job. So today we want to make you an offer." The trainees, intrigued, listened to the offer. "If at any time you feel this is not the right place, that you're not going to excel and grow here, then pull a trainer aside and say, 'I want to take the offer. And we'll pay you $1,000 to leave.'" That's right, Zappos offers its new employees $1,000 to quit. In fact, by late 2011, the amount had increased to $4,000. Wolsk went home and told his wife, "You're never going to believe this." The offer prompted him to think carefully about his commitment to the firm. Did he really want to spend his time providing the maniacal customer service that Zappos expected? Was the loud, chaotic environment too much to handle every day? Was he sufficiently weird to appreciate the quirks of the culture? And was he sure enough about his answers to turn down $1,000 in cash? "If I say no to this offer," he thought, "then I am buying in." He rejected the offer and has worked at Zappos ever since. In fact, only 2% of Zappos' trainees take the money and leave. Often they are the same people the trainers already had doubts about. The offer manages to make everyone involved a little happier. Departing employees leave happy because of the check. Zappos' execs are happy because they avoid the far more expensive prospect of managing people who aren't a good fit. Even the employees who turn down the offer are happier. They've put a stake in the ground. "I'd rather be here than take the money in a way that feels good." Why is this offer, an artificial choice inserted into the training regimen, so effective at separating good hires from bad ones? Barry Kirshner, a sales manager for Showtime Networks in Cincinnati, said YouTube has provided him with a few aha moments in life. One of the most enlightening, in a day-to-day sort of way, was a 56-second video on how to peel a banana. "Since a young age," he said, "I have always peeled a banana from the stem. But often you mush the banana as you try to force your fingers into the peel." The YouTube video he saw, which has been viewed over 3.3 million times, shows that you can peel a banana more easily from the bottom. No mushing required. It also eliminates the temptation, when the stem doesn't break easily, to bite it and experience the banana skin taste backlash. When we act on autopilot, our behavior goes unexamined. When's the last time you thought carefully about the way you peel a banana or take a shower? We gain a lot from this ability to selectively tune out parts of our experience. When we can take a shower on autopilot, it frees up our minds to consider other things. Like whether you could make a living from offering fruit peeling tips on YouTube. The problem, of course, is that sometimes these autopilot behaviors deserve more scrutiny. Most of us have been mashing bananas since childhood. And while that's no big tragedy, what if there were better ways to deal with more important activities, handling our email inbox, or responding to customer requests, or carrying on a good conversation with our family at dinner? It's hard to interrupt these autopilot cycles because, well, that's the whole point of autopilot. We don't think about what we are doing. We drift along in life, floating on the wake of past choices, and it's easy to forget that we have the ability to change direction. A woman from Alabama dreams of visiting Italy. One year she has the chance to go but postpones the trip because of responsibilities at work. Time slips by, and she thinks often of Italy, but years turn into decades, and eventually her health deteriorates to the point where she can't make the trip. When, exactly, did she choose not to visit Italy? Was it every day? Or never? She surely never expected that her first decision, to postpone the trip, would become a permanent one. One solution to this is to bundle our decisions with tripwires, signals that would snap us awake at exactly the right moment, compelling us to reconsider a decision or to make a new one. Think of the way that the low fuel warning in your car lights up, grabbing your attention. If only the woman from Alabama had an Italy warning that lit up before she lost her health. The goal of a tripwire is to jolt us out of our unconscious routines and make us aware that we have a choice to make. For David Lee Roth, a brown M&M in the bowl backstage at the band's concerts acted as a tripwire, warning him to pay careful attention to the staging. Zappos uses a tripwire with its new hires. Its $1,000 offer takes the quiet, nagging doubts experienced by some employees. "I'm not sure if this is the right job for me," and crystallizes them into a moment of decision. The Zappos trainer explicitly warns them about autopilot. "We don't want you to just stick around." Inside organizations, though, it can be hard to change course, because an infrastructure gets built up around past decisions. A decision to launch a new product, for instance, creates a budget and a staff and a set of processes, all of which will tend to deter a change in direction. Because of this inertia, the deep footprints of past decisions, it can be hard for leaders to change even when they know they must. The company Eastman Kodak makes a fascinating example of this, because twice it succeeded, against the odds, at making critical transformations, only to fall short on the third. The founder of Eastman Kodak, George Eastman, was a bank clerk in Rochester, and in the late 1870s, he planned a sunny vacation to Santo Domingo. Hoping to take photos on his vacation, he bought the requisite tools: camera, film, chemicals, developing equipment, but was frustrated with how messy and bulky the gear was. He was so frustrated, in fact, that he canceled his vacation and resolved to create a better solution himself. At the time, cameras used wet chemicals on glass plates to capture images, but Eastman pursued a dry process, which he heard had been used successfully in England. In 1881, after 3 years of tinkering, he obtained a patent on a dry plate process, and founded Eastman Dry Plate, later renamed Eastman Kodak, which we will abbreviate as Kodak. Surely he would have been shocked to learn that his company would still exist over 130 years later, though. Sadly, in January 2012, the company declared bankruptcy, due substantially to the story that follows. The company's extraordinary longevity was due, at least in part, to its leaders' knack for reinventing their core technology. The first reinvention came shortly after the founding of the company. Eastman came to realize that glass plates, even dry ones, would never be suitable for amateurs. They were too big and fragile and expensive. So he invented a roll of film made of paper, which later evolved into the celluloid film still available today. Professional photographers scoffed at the poor quality of the paper-based images, but the camera was an immediate hit with the public. It made photography convenient. By 1898, Eastman had rolled out the first Brownie camera, which cost only $1, with rolls of film available for 15 cents. Within 4 years, the company sold 80% to 90% of the world's celluloid film. Kodak's second reinvention came early in the 20th century, with the advent of color film. As with the first generation of paper film, the image quality of the color prints was poor at first, but Eastman could see that color film will be the future. He invested heavily in the company's R&D efforts, and in the 1920s, after repeated failures, Kodak released the high-quality color film. After the color revolution, the market for film stabilized for decades, with Kodak holding steady as a market leader. By the 1960s, the stage had been set for a third revolution, digital photography. During some of the first flights into space, NASA used digital technology to send images back to Earth, and in 1972, Texas Instruments filed a patent on a filmless electronic camera. Less than a decade later, Sony Corporation introduced the world's first commercial electronic camera, the Mavica. Kodak's leaders monitored all of these developments and encouraged experimentation with digital technology in the company labs. But they never seemed to admit to themselves that the future was digital. Even when pushed by their partners and suppliers, they were slow to move. Often this reluctance emerged from a kind of scientific pride. Film is simply superior to digital. It was hard for them to imagine that the public would abandon a superior technology for an inferior one. An ironic attitude, of course, for the company that had offended photo snobs with its Brownie camera. In 1981, a team inside Kodak assessed the threat that would be posed by digital technology during the decade to follow. The report concluded that during the 1980s, the quality of prints from electronic images will not be generally acceptable to consumers, as replacement for prints based on the science of photography, i.e., film. The consumer's desire to handle, display, and distribute prints cannot be replaced by electronic display devices. Electronic systems camera and viewing input device for TV will not be low enough in price to have widespread appeal. There's a whiff of confirmation bias in these conclusions. They seem to say, we are doing just fine, aren't we? To be fair, though, the report's predictions were dead on accurate. All of them proved correct during the 1980s and, in fact, well into the 1990s. During that period, though, the groundwork was being laid for a permanent transformation of the industry. Once the public embraced cell phones and the internet, crucial enabling technologies, the move to digital technology was irreversible. By 2002, sales of digital cameras had eclipsed those of traditional cameras. By 2011, a generation of students was enrolling in college, who had likely never developed a roll of film. This was a wave that Kodak had seen coming for decades, yet the company was capsized. After reaching a peak market capitalization of $31 billion in 1997, Kodak began to decline, slowly at first but with a nasty plunge starting in 2007. By mid-2011, the company's market cap had sunk below $2 billion, and in January 2012 it filed for bankruptcy. What happened? The story of the decline is complex, featuring a succession of highly touted but ultimately unsuccessful CEOs, as well as a series of deals that attempted to put a digital veneer on the company's traditional film business. One of those attempts was the Advantix Preview camera, which featured a cutting-edge digital display on the back. Sounds promising, right? Except that the display existed only so that you could preview the pictures you'd take on film, and subsequently get developed at the local photomat. Which is a bit like selling a tiny, pocket-sized phone that must be plugged into the wall to make a call. During this long period, when Kodak's goose was being slow-cooked, the company's executives missed opportunity after opportunity to reverse course. The alarm bells, signaling that the film business was in trouble, were omnipresent, yet they were never insistent enough to overcome the seductive voice that kept telling Kodak execs, the film business is still lucrative. Let's just wait and see what happens. It's the same voice we've all encountered in different forms. My boyfriend still doesn't treat me the way I want him to, but maybe he will change. I'll just wait and see what happens. Or, I know our sales aren't going as well as we'd predicted, but before we reconsider our strategy, let's just wait and see what happens. Kodak's executives were trapped in autopilot. They were coasting with the momentum of past choices. They needed a tripwire to snap them to attention and force a choice. What kind of tripwire could Kodak's executives have used? The answer is right in their own 1981 report. Notice how easy it is to turn a hopeful prediction into an early warning alarm system. For instance, because day-to-day change is gradual, even imperceptible, it's hard to know when to jump. Tripwires tell you when to jump. Setting tripwires would not have guaranteed that Kodak's leaders made the right decisions. Sometimes even a clear alarm is willfully ignored. We probably all ignored a fire alarm, trusting that it is false. But tripwires at least ensure that we are aware it's time to make a decision, that we don't miss our chance to choose because we've been lulled into autopilot. 2. chances are you know someone who has been stuck on autopilot too long. Sometimes autopilot causes people to neglect opportunities. Maybe you have a friend who has talked about writing a novel for years, but never seems to make any progress. Other times, autopilot leads people to persist at efforts that seem doomed, like a couple whose relationship makes them both miserable, or a relative with a naive dream of making a living as a landscape painter, or an executive who refuses to recognize that her pet project has failed. At some point, the virtue of being persistent turns into the vice of denying reality. When the transformation happens, how can you snap someone out of it? One option is to set a deadline, the most familiar form of a tripwire. Some deadlines are natural, such as the deadline for filing stories at a daily newspaper. The printing press has to roll at a certain time, whether the story is ready or not. But it's easy to forget that most of the deadlines we encounter in life are simply made up. They are artificially created tripwires, to force an action or a decision. Some deadlines are backed by the force of law, such as the IRS's April 15th deadline for submitting taxes, and it's no shock that these deadlines are effective. What's stranger is the effectiveness of made-up deadlines in getting us to do what would have been good for us anyway. The psychologists Amos Tversky and Eldar Schaefer offered college students a $5 reward for filling out a survey. When given a 5-day deadline, 66% of the students completed the survey and claimed their rewards. When given no deadline, only 25% ever collected their money. The same phenomenon has been noted with substantially higher stakes. In Great Britain, the Economic and Social Research Council, which gives grants to university researchers in areas such as global economics, security, and education, decided to eliminate submission deadlines and accept proposals on a rolling basis. Research professors should have been relieved. Instead of having to submit proposals on a couple of fixed dates, usually smack dab in the midst of teaching commitments, they were now being given the flexibility to submit a proposal whenever they had time to do so. Proposal submissions promptly declined by 15% to 20%. This is not rational behavior. If students like the idea of getting $5 for a survey, and if researchers need grant money, then they shouldn't need a deadline to follow through. Yet while irrational, this behavior probably makes sense to all of us. Deadlines focus our mental spotlight on a choice. They grab us by the collar and say, if you're gonna do this, you have to do it now. In this light, consider the tradition of the annual performance review for employees. People including us have poked fun at the idea of giving feedback to employees only once a year. What parents would swallow their feedback day after day, storing it up for one December day, when they'd sit their kids down and let it rip? While once-a-year feedback is inadequate, though, it's superior to never-a-year feedback. Absent the deadline, that would probably be the norm. The annual review, then, is really a kind of desperate tripwire, ensuring that something critical happens at least once a year. If you have a relative or colleague who is pursuing a bad path on autopilot, or if you think they're being overconfident about their chances of success, work with them to set up tripwires, and hold them accountable to what they predicted. 6 months ago, you thought you'd have a recording contract by now. These will not be easy conversations to have. No one likes to be reminded of failure. Nor is there any certainty that they will change course. Overconfidence is a powerful force. The optimistic entrepreneur will always believe that sales will skyrocket next year, and the aspiring singer will feel that she could be discovered at any moment. But certainly you have a better chance of reining in foolish decisions when those decisions are considered than when they are left unexamined. Another strategy, beyond dates and measurements, is to use a partition as a tripwire. Imagine that you're eating lunch in a sub shop, and you've bought a small bag of chips to go with your meal. When you finish the bag, you might still crave more chips, but to get them you'd have to make an active decision to walk up to the counter and buy another bag. Almost certainly, you wouldn't do that. However, what if the sub shop had provided chips in a refillable bowl, like a Mexican restaurant that brings out tortilla chips? It's easy to imagine that you might have eaten 2 or 3 small bags worth of chips in one sitting. In the terminology of the researchers Dilip Soman and Amar Chima, the small bag acts as a partition. It breaks up a resource chips by dividing it into discrete portions. Soman and Chima have found that partitioning is an effective way to make us more thoughtful about what we consume, because it forces us to make a conscious decision about whether to continue. In one study, participants volunteered to help with a cookie tasting study. Tough gig. Every participant received 24 cookies in a box that was easily resealable, to keep the cookies fresh. But inside half the boxes was a minor difference. Each cookie was individually wrapped in foil. That minor difference had a major effect. The people who got the unwrapped cookies finishing them, on average, in 6 days. Meanwhile, those who got the individually wrapped cookies took 24 days. The foil wrapper was acting as a partition, forcing people to contemplate whether they wanted to keep going. Which suggests that we might be able to help casino-addicted retirees by wrapping slot machines in foil. Actually, that slot machine comment isn't entirely a joke. In another study, participants gambled less when their funds were spread across 10 envelopes, rather than crammed into a single envelope. Soman also found that day laborers, paid in cash, dramatically increased their savings rates when they divided their wages across several envelopes. This kind of partition effect probably explains why credit cards encourage excessive spending. They permit us to spend without partitions, like eating from a bag of chips the size of your couch. Some venture capital investors use a variety of this partitioning logic. Rather than investing a huge chunk of money up front, the investors might choose to dole it out over time, across a series of rounds. Each round would initiate a new conversation. Do we have the right plan? Are customers happy with what we are producing? The partitions compel the entrepreneurs to be intentional about their behavior. What we're seeing with these partitioning examples is an additional advantage of tripwires. Initially, we highlighted the useful way that tripwires can snap us out of autopilot. But partitions are doing something different. They're setting boundaries. Boundaries are necessary because of people's tendency to escalate their commitment to their choices. For a simple example, think of a kid playing an arcade game. She's been on a zombie killing mission, but she made a mistake and her character died, and now she must burn a few more credits to keep playing. It feels so hard to walk away at that point. She might have invested several dollars and 20 minutes to get where she was. If she walks away, she loses everything. Isn't it worth a few more credits to keep going? This is a conscious decision, not an autopilot choice. But there's still a trap involved, because if she doesn't interrupt the cycle at some point, she'll burn through all her arcade money having never played another game. And that is not a recipe for happiness. Imagine, instead, if that same girl had walked into the arcade with 3 different swipe cards or piles of quarters. If you have an old-school arcade, and she mentally allocated 1 swipe card to the zombie game. That's a tripwire. Its role is to disrupt the cycle of steady escalation. Once she burns through that first swipe card, she'll feel some self-generated pressure to quit. And if she decides to break into the second card, it will hurt a bit, because she'll know that she's blowing through her mental budget. This same budgeting dynamic is present in much more important decisions, of course. Think of romantic relationships or business investments. We've committed so much already, isn't it worth just a little more? If you're dating someone who has commitment issues, could you set a 3-month tripwire to see whether you're making any progress? Or if a project at work has stalled out, could you set a $50,000 budget limit on the funds you'll use to jumpstart? With a right tripwire, we can ensure that we don't throw good money or time after bad. All this worrying about traps and contingencies may make tripwires sound overly cautious, the bicycle helmet of decision-making. But actually we want to argue the opposite, that tripwires encourage risk-taking by letting us carve out a safe space for experimentation. Say your husband wants to start a business creating topiary sculptures for clients. You think the idea is bonkers, but you admire his passion, so it seems cruel to veto it. Instead, set a tripwire. Okay, dear, let's give the topiary sculpture business a shot, but can we agree that we won't invest more than $10,000 of our savings in it? Alternatively, you might say, go for it, but if you don't have a paying customer within 3 months, let's talk seriously about Plan B. Tripwires like those can cap your risk, and they can also create a kind of psychic comfort, because they allow you and your spouse to stay on autopilot until the trigger is reached. That is, if you're only 2 months in, or if you've only burned $4,300 of the budget, then you can relax. No reason to worry or fight or agonize about it. You're on track, and you can trust the tripwire to tell you when to pay attention again. Similarly, if Kodak's executives had set tripwires, they could have relaxed and stayed focused on the film business right up until the moment when one of their conditions was tripped. In short, tripwires allow us the certainty of committing to a course of action, even a risky one, while minimizing the costs of overconfidence. 3. A variation of the tripwire idea was used, to life-saving effect, by Lucile Packard Children's Hospital LPCH, part of Stanford University's hospital system. LPCH is the treatment center of last resort for children in the San Francisco Bay Area. The cases in our general care wards are like the patients in other hospitals' intensive care units, said Kit Lang, a quality manager at LPCH. At a conference on quality in medicine, Lang became convinced that some deaths at LPCH were preventable. The conference was sponsored by the Institute for Healthcare Improvement IHI, which had launched a 100,000 Lives campaign to stop patient deaths due to medical error and ineffective practices. The IHI observed that many patient emergencies could be prevented if early signs of trouble were addressed quickly, and to enable the quick response, it urged hospitals to create rapid response teams, sometimes called RRTs. In a typical situation, a nurse who noticed something odd about a patient's vitals could summon a rapid response team, a diverse team of medical professionals, who would convene quickly at the patient's bedside to analyze the situation. The idea appealed to Lang because she knew that, while adults tend to decline gradually and predictably, kids often crater suddenly. As an experienced cardiovascular ICU nurse, Carla Ernest, said, they hold on for a long time, then boom, they hit a wall, where they can't hold on anymore. Often, by the time a nurse called a code sounding an emergency signal that the kid's life was at stake, it was too late to save them. The advantage of rapid response teams, Lang knew, was that they encouraged action, before it was too late, before it was necessary to call a code. She convinced her colleagues to give the idea a try. In the training sessions, the instructor passed out cards listing 6 tripwires that warranted calling in the RRT. 5 of the tripwires involve objective measures, such as acute changes in heart rate, blood pressure, or oxygen saturation. The 6th tripwire, at the top of the card, was the most important, call the rapid response team, if you are worried about a patient. Some of the ICU staffers were skeptical about that provision, worrying that it turned over too much control to frontline nurses. What if nurses overused rapid response teams, distracting doctors from their work in the ICU? Despite the skepticism, the hospital moved forward with a pilot of the rapid response program. Over the next 18 months, RRTs were summoned about twice a week, and the most common reason was the one at the top of the card, a nurse was worried about a patient. Carla Ernest, the ICU nurse, said that it was critical that nurses' worries were legitimized as a tripwire. Ernest said, as a bedside nurse, it doesn't force you to be able to articulate, I'm seeing this change in respiratory rate or that change in heart rate. You can just ask for help, come look at this kid, he doesn't look good. When the doctors and nurses realized they were catching problems earlier than before, their confidence in the program grew. While calling a code had always been pretty rare, it only happened 2-3 times per 1,000 patients. It was clear that, thanks to rapid response teams, the incidents were growing even rarer. Lang and Ernest said that during the first few weeks of the rollout, they kept hearing, why didn't we think of this a long time ago? A 2007 article in the Journal of the American Medical Association summarized the results of the project over the first 18 months. Due to rapid response teams, the number of code calls outside the ICU had fallen by 71%. Problems were being detected and headed off earlier. That early action saved lives, hospital mortality dropped by 18%. The 143 rapid response team calls made over the 18-month period saved an estimated 33 lives. The fears that critical personnel would be drawn away from the ICU were misguided. In fact, the RRT actually freed up resources. You're spending 20 minutes turning around a kid in an RRT situation, said Lang, versus an hour or more in a code situation. 33 kids went home safely to their parents, as the result of a simple set of tripwires. Earlier in the chapter, the tripwires we encountered were well defined: a $1,000 offer at Zappos, a deadline for completing a survey, a budget limit for your spouse's topiary sculpture business. Notice that the children's hospital situation is a little different. The most important tripwire requires nurses to call for help when they are worried about a patient. It's a little fuzzy, a little subjective. As a result, the rapid response team members can't predict when they'll hit that tripwire or how many times they'll trip it. These tripwires aren't tripped by clear-cut measures like budgets or dates or partitions, they are tripped by pattern recognition. This is an important distinction, because in many organizations, pattern matching is the skill that leaders desperately want their employees to have. They want their employees to be alert for threats and opportunities in the environment. They would like employees to recognize the pattern when they see it pop up, and to feel that they have permission to act when it does. That was a powerful feature of the rapid response team protocol. Anytime nurses spotted a kid who didn't quite look right, the protocol made it socially acceptable for them to raise their voices and say, "I think we've got a problem." Of course, the same idea is applicable to opportunities as well as threats. Organizational leaders need people to be sensitive to changes in the environment, and to be brave enough to speak up. Here's something new. Here's a great opportunity for us. Peter Drucker challenged executives to capitalize on unexpected success. He wrote, "When a new venture does succeed, more often than not it is in a market other than the one it was originally intended to serve, with products or services not quite those with which it had set out, bought in large part by customers it did not even think of when it started, and used for a host of purposes besides the ones for which the products were first designed." If a new venture does not anticipate this, organizing itself to take advantage of the unexpected and unseen markets, then it will succeed only in creating an opportunity for a competitor. One great story of unexpected success is Rogaine, the drug that helps bald men regrow some of their hair, which was discovered by accident. Rogaine's active ingredient, minoxidil, is also the chief ingredient in a drug called Lonidine, which was taken by many patients to lower their blood pressure. Lonidine had a surprising side effect, though. Patients started sprouting new hair on their arms, back, and legs. As you can imagine, this was not a popular side effect. The scientists at Upjohn were clever enough to recognize the opportunity buried in the problem, and they reformulated the drug into the anti-balding elixir that we know as Rogaine today. The discovery of Viagra was a similar story. Initially, the drug had been tested as a treatment for chest pain angina, and for that purpose it was a failure. Then patients started reporting a curious side effect. Imagine those awkward conversations: "Doc, my chest still hurts but, I've been noticing an effect somewhere else." One journalist concluded from these stories and others like them, that the pharmaceutical industry is driven as much by luck as by design. But that's not quite right, because luck didn't make Rogaine. It took discipline to spot and monetize the opportunities represented by these flukes. Let's be honest, it was not self-evident that unwanted back hair heralded a billion-dollar opportunity. This is the same kind of pattern matching tripwire that allowed the rapid response teams to succeed. While the nurses were sensitized to signs of trouble, the pharma scientists were sensitized to signs of opportunity. Could you define a similar tripwire for your team members? Could you sensitize them to the kinds of opportunities that Drucker called unexpected success? A small business owner might coach her employees: "If you see people using our product in a way we haven't anticipated, let's talk about it." A high school department chair might say, "If you try out a new assignment that really seems to get students motivated, let's discuss it in our next meeting." By coaching people to recognize patterns of threat or opportunity, you can take advantage of a phenomenon we've all experienced, the seeing it everywhere effect. You learn a new concept or word, and suddenly you start to notice it everywhere. The website 1000 Awesome Things identifies this phenomena as awesome thing number 523. Dozens of commenters have shared their experiences with the phenomena. This is such a very, very true awesome thing. Haberdashery was one of the most recent words I learned. Who knew it was even a real word? My prof mentioned that Harry Truman used to be a haberdasher, and next thing you know, my grandma uses it. I spot it on little shop signs. It's on the wall at Eastside Mario's. Small world. I remember as a little kid coming across the word feasible. Next day at chess club, one of the books we used to give us tips on the game used that word again and again and again. My game didn't really improve that much, but my vocabulary did. Awesome, indeed. Justin Bieber is what I learned and now can't avoid. I'm pretty sure it's made me dumber, though. And I've started to contemplate suicide. By labeling a tripwire, you can make it easier to recognize, just as it's easier to spot the word haberdashery when you've just learned it. Pilots, for example, are taught to pay careful attention to what are called lemurs, the vague feeling that something isn't right, even if it's not clear why. Having a label for those feelings legitimizes them, and makes pilots less likely to dismiss them. The flash of recognition, "Oh, this is a lemur," causes a quick shift from autopilot to manual control, from unconscious to conscious behavior. The quick switch is what we need so often in life, a reminder that our current trajectory need not be permanent. Tripwires provide a sudden recognition that precedes our actions. I have a choice. Chapter 11 in one page set of Tripwire 1. In life, we naturally slip into autopilot, leaving past decisions unquestioned. E.g., we've all been peeling bananas from the top. Nothing ever compelled us to reconsider it. 2. A tripwire can snap us awake and make us realize we have a choice. Zappos' $1,000 offer created a conscious fork in the road for new hires. David Lee Roth's Brown M&M signaled that he needed to inspect the production. 3. Tripwires can be especially useful when change is gradual. Digital images killed Kodak. Its executives could have used tripwires to spark a bolder response. 4. For people stuck on autopilot, consider deadlines or partitions. 6 months ago, you thought you'd have a recording contract by now. Partitions, day laborers save more when their pay was put in 10 envelopes versus 1. 5. We tend to escalate our investment in poor decisions. Partitions can help rein that in. E.g., we won't allocate more than $50,000 to jumpstart this failing project. 6. Tripwires can actually create a safe space for risk-taking. They, 1. Cap risk, and 2. Quiet your mind until the trigger is hit. 7. Many powerful tripwires are triggered by patterns rather than dates, metrics, budgets. Unexpected problems. A children's hospital told nurses to call the rapid response team if they were worried about a patient. Peter Drucker, be ready for unexpected success. Rogaine scientists were savvy enough to spot the opportunity in back hair growth. 8. Tripwires can provide a precious realization: we have a choice to make. Note that partitioning is better suited to self-control type issues, like saving money or resisting cookies. When you start thinking about how to implement the principle in an office environment, it can get a little weird. For example, imagine that you wanted your coworkers to be more thoughtful about their use of the color printer, so you created a partition that required them to click a button after every 10 pages printed. That kind of thing could lead to bloodshed very quickly. We mentioned this campaign briefly in the last chapter. An expert from the IHI was helping the 100,000 Hums team with its campaign. Chapter 12. 12. Trusting the process. 1. Most of our day-to-day decisions, which route to take to work, which sandwich to buy for lunch, are pretty effortless. But the tough calls can take a toll. For most of us who work in organizations, those tough calls are likely to be group decisions. Throughout the book, we've discussed ways of nudging, prodding, and inspiring groups to make better decisions, seeking out one more option. Finding someone else who solved our problem. Asking, what would have to be true for you to be right? Switching as a way to dampen politics. Making big decisions based on core priorities. Running pre-mortems and prep raids. Laying down tripwires. Using these techniques will improve the results of your group decisions. We should also address the aftermath of decisions, because most decisions come with at least a bit of collateral damage for those whose ideas weren't accepted: anger, hurt feelings, or loss of confidence in the new direction. How can you ensure that a decision is seen as fair? The RAP process, if used routinely, will contribute to that sense of fairness, because it allows people to understand how the decision is being made, and it gives them comfort that decisions will be made in a consistent manner. Beyond RAP, there are a few additional ideas to consider as you navigate group decisions. The most direct and difficult way to make a fair decision is to involve as many people as possible and get them all to agree. Remember Paul C. Nutt, the collector of organizational decisions, who found that most organizations consider just one alternative. In one of his later studies, he analyzed how the final choice was made across 376 important decisions at organizations such as General Electric, NASA, and General Motors. He found that only 1 in 7 decisions incorporated an approach he called bargaining, which is basically the art of compromise, ensuring that when multiple parties disagree, they horse trade until they find a solution that most people can live with. Though bargaining wasn't used very often, when used it always improved the success of the decision, and Nutt described the improvement as dramatic. You can be forgiven if you're having one of two skeptical reactions right now. 1 reaction: compromise is sloppy and inelegant. Compromise is like the old joke, a camel is a horse made by a committee. The iPhone wasn't a committee product. And if you're in an organization like Apple with clear alignment of values and a growth trajectory that distracts from disagreements, then some kinds of compromise may be unnecessary or even counterproductive. However, Apple is the exception that proves the rule. Imagine the CEO of General Motors expecting major concessions from unions because of the elegance of its design vision. Good luck with that. When you've got multiple powerful parties involved in a decision, compromise is unavoidable. The point is not that compromise is a necessary evil. Rather, compromise can be valuable in itself, because it demonstrates that you've made use of diverse opinions, which is a way of limiting risk. Here's why: bargainers come to the table with different options, which helps their group dodge a narrow frame. Indeed, bargainers typically consider at least 2 complete alternatives in making a decision, as opposed to the 1 alternative considered in other decisions. Also, bargainers tend to act as devil's advocates for each other, asking the disconfirming questions that people don't always ask themselves. If a superintendent hatches an ambitious new plan for her district and pushes it through, against opposition, she's taking a big risk. What if her diagnosis of the district's problems and her solution are flat wrong? On the other hand, if she bargains with her staff and teachers, she may come out with a watered-down plan, but it might be watered down only in the sense that the parts that were least likely to work have been removed. The second skeptical reaction you might have to bargaining is this: yes, involving lots of people in a decision is a wonderful idea, and it would be fantastic to negotiate to the point where everyone agreed, but come on, get a grip, we don't have time to do that. The business world thrives on quick decisions, and you can't build consensus quickly. This objection must be conceded. Bargaining is indeed a slower way to make a decision. But that's not the right way to judge its effectiveness, because decisions are a means to an end. Your group might need to pick a software solution for handling customer support calls, but that decision isn't the end goal. The end goal is to make customers happier, which means not only that you've picked the right solution, but that your staff is using it enthusiastically in a way that pleases customers. In other words, success requires 2 stages: first the decision and then the implementation. That's why the initial slowness of bargaining may be offset by a critical advantage: it speeds up implementation. The superintendent can make a lightning-fast decision if she makes it autocratically, but if her administrators and teachers hate it, then adoption will come to a standstill. So where do you want to spend your time? Bargaining up front, or fighting foot-draggers later? Bargaining yields buy-in. This isn't to suggest, of course, that by bargaining you can always make everyone happy. Some decisions will leave a subset of people worse off, as the necessary cost of doing something great for many others or for the organization itself. If those people who lose consider the decision process fair, it can make a huge difference in the way they react. Consider two different small claims court cases. Case 1: Carlos is suing Mike, a contractor, for shoddy work installing new granite countertops. Carlos testifies that he had to hire another contractor to redo the installation, and he is seeking a refund of the $650 in labor that Mike charged him. The judge listens respectfully to both. Eventually, the judge rules for Carlos, explaining that the verdict hinged on a couple of photos that suggested Mike may not have secured the counter adequately. Case 2: Annalisa is suing her house-sitter, Jen, for killing her fish. Annalisa contends that Jen failed to feed the tropical fish on the precise schedule she had left. By the time Annalisa came home, they were bobbing at the top of the tank. Jen contends that she really did honor the obsessive feeding schedule, as far as she can recall. As Annalisa begins to share more evidence, the judge cuts her off abruptly and rules for Jen, muttering something about how it's just impossible to keep fish alive for long. These two cases were adjudicated quite differently. Case 1 sounds like a fair process and Case 2 doesn't. Researchers who study court cases like these find a consistent pattern in the aftermath of the verdicts. The winners Carlos and Jen are happy with the decisions. No surprise there. Though Jen is a bit less happy than Carlos, because of the judge's flakiness. But there is a sharp contrast in how the losers feel about their experiences. Annalisa, the fish owner, who lost the unfair case, is absolutely furious about the outcome. She didn't even get to finish her testimony. The biggest surprise, though, concerns Mike, the contractor who lost the countertop case. While he emerges less happy than Carlos the winner, he's almost as happy. In fact, Mike might actually be happier than Jen, who won the unfair case. Researchers call this sense of fairness procedural justice, i.e., the procedures used to make a decision were just as distinct from distributive justice, which is concerned with whether the spoils of a decision were divvied up fairly. An extensive body of research confirms that procedural justice is critical in explaining how people feel about a decision. It's not just the outcome that matters, it's the process. The elements of procedural justice are straightforward: give people a chance to be heard, to present their case. Really listen to what people say. Use accurate information to make the decision, and give people a chance to challenge the information if it's incorrect. Apply principles consistently across situations. Avoid bias and self-interest. Explain why the decision was made, and be candid about relevant risks or concerns. Surely there's no genuine debate about whether this is the right way to make a decision. Anyone want to argue for inconsistent, disrespectful decisions? True, there may be times when we value our own idea more than a fair process and times when we choose expediency over procedural justice. But there may also be times when we are trying to deliver procedural justice, but find that our efforts aren't recognized. Think about the need to listen attentively, for instance. You might listen carefully to one of your colleagues, nodding to signal your attention. In your own head, you really are listening. You're delivering one of the pillars of procedural justice. From your colleague's perspective, though, it's not as clear. You might be listening, or you might be contemplating your rejoinder. You need a way to make the reality visible. Robert Mnookin faces this issue as a mediator in high-stakes corporate cases. One case he handled involved Sony suing Apple for copyright infringement and Apple countersuing. Given the amount of animosity he has to contend with, it's critical that he be seen as delivering procedural justice. So he doesn't just listen, as he says, I stayed back the other side's position better than they could state it. And then they can relax because they feel heard. When you can articulate someone's point of view better than they can, it's de facto proof that you are really listening. The same goes for defending a decision. If you've made a decision that had some opposition, those opponents need to know that you haven't made the decision blindly or naively. Our first instinct, when challenged, is usually to dig in further and passionately defend our position. Surprisingly, though, sometimes the opposite can be more effective. Dave Hitz, the founder of NetApp, says he learned that sometimes the best way to defend a decision is to point out its flaws. In his funny autobiography, How to Castrate a Bull, he explains how he handles opposition. Let's say you have decided to pursue Plan A. As a manager, it is part of your job to defend and explain the decision to folks who work for you. So, when someone marches into your office to explain that Plan A sucks and that Plan Z would be much better, what do? My old instinct was to listen to Plan Z, say what I didn't like about it, and to describe, as best as I could, why Plan A was better. Of course, the person has already seen these same arguments in the email I send announcing the decision, but since they didn't agree, they must not have heard me clearly, so I better repeat my argument again, right? I can report that this seldom worked very well. It works much better if I start out by agreeing, yep. Plan Z is a reasonable plan. Not only for the reasons you mentioned, but here are 2 more advantages. And Plan A, the plan that we chose, not only has the flaws that you mentioned, but here are 3 more flaws. The effect of this technique is amazing. It seems completely counterintuitive, but even if you don't convince people that your plan is better, hearing you explain your plan's flaws and their plan's advantages makes them much more comfortable. Hitz's logic defies our natural PR instincts. Aren't we supposed to vociferously defend our positions? Won't we spook people if we admit weakness? No. Hitz has it right. A manager's self-criticism is comforting, rather than anxiety-producing, because it signals that she is making a reality-based decision. The manager is saying, in essence, we are making an informed bet that this decision will work, but we'll be monitoring it closely. We've reality tested, and we have set tripwires. On the other hand, if the manager, confronted with criticism, becomes a press secretary for the decision and immediately retreats to her talking points, it's unsettling, because it makes her team worry that even if the decision is a fiasco, she won't change direction. 2. The procedural justice research shows that people care deeply about process. We all want to believe that a decision process that affects us is fair, that it is taking into account all the right information. Even if the outcome goes against us, our confidence in the process is critical. By acknowledging flaws in his decisions, Hitz is encouraging his team to put their faith in the process rather than in a single decision. Individual decisions will frequently be wrong, but the right process will be an ally in any situation. To see how a process can help, even with a deeply personal decision, consider Matt Darigo, a non-profit leader. Darigo's story begins with a time when his family was battered by heartbreaking news. In 1991, during the spring semester of his freshman year at Spring Hill College in Mobile, Alabama, Darigo learned that his mother had been diagnosed with stomach cancer. His dad brought the family, Darigo and his 4 sisters, together to discuss the situation. The doctors were hopeful that his mom's cancer might be manageable, so Darigo returned to school, worried but optimistic. During the same semester, his older sister Kate started complaining about pain in her shoulder. The pain continued through the summer, when doctors did an MRI and found a tumor. She had lymphoma. During the late summer and early fall, Darigo's mother and sister went through chemotherapy together. Our whole world was turned upside down, he said. Darigo decided not to return to school in the fall, choosing to stay with his family in Boston. During that difficult time, what kept him sane was art. He painted, finding it therapeutic, a way of quieting his anxieties. As the year went on, his sister got better and his mother got worse. In early December, doctors found that his mother's cancer had spread again, and a few weeks after Christmas, she passed away. Darigo, distraught, continued to paint every day. One day, it dawned on him that what art did for him could do for others. Suddenly he knew, this is what I'm supposed to do. I'm supposed to help kids through art. He never shared this epiphany with anyone. He was self-conscious about it, worrying that people would think it was a stupid idea. Eventually he went back to his life. He completed school, took a few jobs, and after a few moves landed in San Diego. Almost 10 years after he'd had his epiphany, he found that he couldn't ignore it anymore. He talked to his dad about the idea, and his dad offered him $5,000 in seed money. His sister Kate sent him books about how to start a nonprofit. He founded Arts A Reason to Survive in 2001, with a mission to comfort sick kids with art. He volunteered to help at the Ronald McDonald House, a place where families stayed while their kids were treated at the Children's Hospital across the street. 2 of the first kids he helped were Riley, a 3-year-old boy going through chemotherapy, and his sister Alexis. For a few precious hours, the sessions helped Riley and his family forget his condition. Darigo taught them how to paint with watercolors, how to do simple drawings. They made get-well cards for other kids at the hospital. One day he put on Beach Boys music, and as they bobbed to the music, they painted a big beach-themed mural. At the end of 2001, Riley died. Darigo drove 4 hours to be at the boy's funeral, and the family asked him to say a few words. Darigo was devastated by Riley's death, but he knew that he was doing what he was meant to do. I wanted to be a bright light for kids in a very dark time, he said. In the early years, Arts was just him and a crew of volunteer artists. They learned to design art projects that kids could complete in one sitting, because, as Darigo said, they were either homeless, abused, or in hospitals, and you weren't sure if you'd see them again the next week or not. Over time, the organization grew, attracting more volunteers and more donations, and Arts went from serving dozens of kids to serving hundreds. By 2007, Darigo had raised enough money to open the Arts Center. The first time the organization had a permanent space designed specifically to inspire kids. It was light, bright, and colorful, he said. As soon as the kids walk through the door, they feel different. At the Arts Center, you might see a kid from juvenile court working on a project with a kid from a homeless shelter and a kid with Down syndrome. It served as a home away from home for many of them. One girl told Darigo, school and home is where you have to keep secrets, and the Arts Center is where you can let your secrets out. In 2011, Arts celebrated its 10th anniversary, but the celebration sparked some internal turmoil in Darigo. For the previous year or two, he'd been feeling a bit unsettled. He'd always dreamed that Arts would spread its work nationally, but so far it had operated only in San Diego. When he brought up his ideas for growth with some board members, they'd usually counsel him to stay focused on the local work. He began to think about leaving Arts, perhaps to start his own consulting practice. He thought maybe he could counsel like-minded nonprofits in other cities. But it was hard to contemplate leaving the organization he'd founded and led for a decade. He agonized about the decision for months, should he stay or leave. At a decision-making workshop led by Chip, Darigo described his dilemma, and he was asked point-blank, imagine that 10 years from now, Arts has been hugely successful in San Diego, serving many more kids than it's serving today. It's a pillar of the local community. But it has no presence anywhere else. Would you be happy? Darigo shook his head. No, I wouldn't, he said. His response shook him up a bit. It made it clear to him that he had to act. He began to consult with peers and funders and a few board members, asking for their advice. One conversation in particular proved pivotal. He met with a woman, who was the CEO of a children's social service agency in San Diego, and he described agonizing over whether to continue expanding Arts' local work, or leave it to pursue the national agenda. She said, Matt, why can't you do all of that? She challenged him to come up with a plan that would keep Arts strong in San Diego, while still allowing him to pursue the idea of spreading the program nationally. He realized she was right, there was no natural barrier to doing both. So he stopped thinking about leaving the organization and started thinking about how to push the ambitions of arts. His first move, in the summer of 2011, was to sound out the board about the new direction. Derigo asked the board members what would make them comfortable with the expanded focus. Their concerns were understandable, they worried about losing focus and spreading the organization's resources too thin. Derigo felt that these were solvable problems. He gave himself a one-year deadline to begin the new work. By the June 30, 2012, board meeting, I will have a plan in place and the approval of the board to move forward on the national expansion of the arts strategy. He knew his San Diego team would need more funding and more staff to make the strategic shift possible, so he hired a new development officer who could lead a more aggressive fundraising campaign. Then he began to beef up his San Diego program staff, freeing himself up to turn his attention nationally. To test his ideas about expansion, he pursued a partnership with a group called La Maestra Community Health Centers, which served recent immigrants from more than 60 countries. Derigo knew that La Maestra was serving kids who needed what arts offered. Imagine the daughter of immigrants, struggling with a new language and culture, who has a parent battling a medical problem. Derigo's idea was to train La Maestra's staff on how to lead arts therapeutic programs. If he succeeded, and the staffers could carry forward his work without his ongoing involvement, it would be solid evidence that he could expand arts' reach nationally, without requiring a giant expansion in staff. Meanwhile, arts' impact in San Diego continued to snowball. Arts seized a great opportunity to take over a facility in the low-income National City neighborhood. The building was an old library that had been renovated by the local government. Now the people in the community were excited about transforming it into an art center. For arts, it was a perfect situation. The building was 3 times the size of their current center and 1/4 of the rent. Within walking distance of the building were a junior high and high school that served kids from impoverished families, as well as several homeless and domestic violence shelters. There were countless neighborhood kids who needed arts. In March 2012, 3 months before his self-imposed deadline, Derigo won approval from his board for the new strategic direction. He felt relieved and hopeful. His enthusiasm was palpable. I'm re-energized. Excited. I feel my creativity rising again. At press time, we don't know whether the new direction for arts and Derigo will be successful. And that's okay, it's the way every decision works. We can't know when we make a choice, whether it will be successful. Success emerges from the quality of the decisions we make and the quantity of luck we receive. We can't control luck. But we can control the way we make choices. Derigo made a good choice. He avoided framing his situation too narrowly. Instead of thinking, should I leave the organization to pursue national expansion or stay at arts? He found a way to do both. He embraced and not or. He reality tested his assumptions, talking with friends and board members and other non-profit leaders. One of them gave him a crucial piece of advice that helped him break out of a narrow frame. Matt, why can't you do all of that? He ooched into his ideas, rather than jumping in headfirst. By working with La Maestra, he could experiment with his new ideas about expansion without taking too much risk. Struggling with a tough choice, he attained some distance on the decision. Confronted with a question about how he'd feel 10 years in the future, if his organization didn't grow beyond San Diego, he realized that he craved more reach. His core priorities demanded that he expand his work. Together with his board, he tried to bookend the future, exploring the reasons why the new direction might fail. That analysis helped them prepare for the worst, knowing that fundraising might suffer in San Diego. As Derigo's attention turned outward, Arts hired a bright, aggressive new development officer. Worried that he might get distracted by the day-to-day firefighting that is a part of every growing organization, he beefed up his program staff and, perhaps most important, set a tripwire. I'll have a plan in place by the June 2012 board meeting. That's what a good decision process looks like. It's not a spreadsheet that spits out the answer when we plug in the numbers. It's not a tally list of pros and cons. It's a guardrail that guides us in the right direction. Derigo is not a man who gravitates toward process. His career has never been driven by decision trees. What his experience demonstrates is that passion and process can work hand in glove. It was a thoughtful process that allowed him to honor his abiding passion, the desire to use art to comfort children in desperate times, the same way that it once comforted him. 3. Our goal in Decisive has been to inspire you to use a better process for making decisions. Not every decision carries the emotional weight of Derigo's decisions. We've encountered a wide range of decisions, some of them exotic, like those involving shark-inspired swimsuits and zip lines in the Costa Rican jungle and diagnostic bowls of M&Ms. We've also seen plenty of important and common life decisions. How do you decide on a job offer? How should you handle a difficult relationship? How do you choose the right college? How do you hire the best people? How can you get a better deal on a car? How can you ensure that you spend time on things that really matter? The same process can guide them all. We can learn to find just one more option. To check our assumptions against reality. To make tough choices based on our core priorities. To prepare humbly for the times when we'll be wrong. The process need not take a long time to be effective. Even if you've only got 45 minutes to consider an important decision, you can accomplish a lot. Run the vanishing options test to see if you might be overlooking a great alternative. Call someone who's solved your problem before. Ask yourself, what would I tell my best friend to do? Or, if you're at work, what would my successor do? Gather 3 friends or colleagues and run a pre-mortem. In our quest to convince you of the merits of a process, we realize we've been facing an uphill battle. It would be hard to find a less inspiring word in the English language than process. It's like trying to get people giddy about an algorithm. What a process provides, though, is more inspiring: confidence. Not cocky overconfidence, that comes from collecting biased information and ignoring uncertainties, but the real confidence, that comes from knowing you've made the best decision that you could. Using a process for decision-making doesn't mean that your choices will always be easy, or that they will always turn out brilliantly, but it does mean you can quiet your mind. You can quit asking, what am I missing? You can stop the cycle of agonizing. Just as important, trusting the process can give you the confidence to take risks. A process can be the equivalent of a mountain climber's harness and rope, allowing you the freedom to explore without constant worry. A process, far from being a drag or a constraint, can actually give you the comfort to be bolder. And bolder is often the right direction. Short-run emotion, as we've seen, makes the status quo seductive. But when researchers ask the elderly what they regret about their lives, they don't often regret something they did, they regret things they didn't do. They regret not seizing opportunities. They regret hesitating. They regret being indecisive. Being decisive is itself a choice. Decisiveness is a way of behaving, not an inherited trait. It allows us to make brave and confident choices, not because we know we'll be right but because it's better to try and fail than to delay and regret. Our decisions will never be perfect, but they can be better. Bolder. Wiser. The right process can steer us toward the right choice. And the right choice, at the right moment, can make all the difference. Chapter 12 and 1 page Trusting the Process 1. Decisions made by groups have an additional burden, they must be seen as fair. 2. Bargaining horse trading until all sides can live with the choice makes for good decisions, that will be seen as fair. Nut, bargaining always improved decision success, the effect was dramatic. Bargaining will take more time upfront but it accelerates implementation. 3. Procedural justice is critical in determining how people feel about a decision. Court cases, losers who perceive procedural justice are almost as happy as winners who don't. 4. We should make sure people are able to perceive that the process is just. High-stakes mediator Mnuchin, I stayed back the other side's position better than they could state it. Entrepreneur hits.